right afterwards. And, you know, we were living in a really, really chaotic time. And China Institute was founded in 1926 at a time of real chaos that was going on in China. And so I think about our mission as being both very, very timely, as well as about being very timeless. And we're here to help connect people and help America better understand some of the underlying, you know, causes and issues and ways to sort of better understand what is arguably, you know, the planet's, you know, one of the most important other countries to occupy the planet. And if nothing else is apparent, it's certainly apparent that there is a dearth of trust between America and between China. And I can't think of anything more emblematic that underscores the paucity of trust than the way that America sees technology and the way that America sees companies like Huawei and see the role and what these elements mean for us. And so I'm just delighted to be able to hopefully shed some light and give people some insight and tools that'll help them sort of at least address and think about some of these really important issues as we live in a time of chaos. It's funny, I might add for you, we have our gallery brings artwork coming from China, and the exhibition before last was called Art in the Time of Chaos. And people said, you know, maybe the timing of that exhibit was a little bit ahead of its time. And in some ways, for an organization that's 96 years old, sometimes we can be ahead of our times. And I hope we're ahead of our times in getting to a deeper understanding of technology, of the role of data, and the way that America thinks about this when it thinks about these things as they relate to China. So you didn't come to listen to me. I'll just make one last pitch, and that is please go to our website. Please stay connected with us. Please consider enrolling and joining up so that you can establish and demonstrate your support for us, which is in turn helps us with our stakeholders. So let me hand it over to our head of programs, Dinda Elliott, to introduce the program and our distinguished panel this afternoon.
Great, thank you, James. We may have to bring that exhibit, Art in the Time of Chaos, back to China Institute. But anyway, I want to thank you so much for joining us today for this important conversation to the audience and especially to our wonderful speakers today. We have Gary Rieschel is one of the most respected investors in China and a real expert on the tech sector, in particular in China and the United States. His VC firm, Qiming Ventures Partners, specializes in the tech and healthcare sectors and has successfully invested more than 30 companies that have grown to more than $1 billion in valuation. It's probably more than that by now, but that's what I found. We have Samm Sacks is a cybersecurity policy and China digital economy fellow at New America. Her research focuses on information and communication technology policies, particularly in China. She has many years of experience in cybersecurity issues. Among other achievements, Sacks launched the industrial cyber business for Siemens in Asia, focusing on the energy sector cybersecurity markets. And we're happy to have Joy Tan, who's SVP based in Washington, D.C. for Huawei, which, as you know, has been placed on the entity list, prohibiting US firms with sensitive information technology from doing business with Huawei without first obtaining a Department of Commerce license. But Huawei's global business continues, and the company has been deploying, in the meantime, has been deploying its 5G technology in the fight against COVID. So we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about a number of things, three in particular: the power of 5G in fighting COVID, privacy issues, and the nature of the debate unfolding in both China and the United States regarding privacy issues, and the outlook for big data sharing between the United States and China. But since Huawei is so much in the news these days, we're going to start with you, Joy. We want to get to big data and COVID in a minute, but I think we need to start with the news. And so I want to ask you, how will the latest US measures to block Huawei from getting advanced chips from US companies affect the business?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. Well, Huawei's business has been impacted since May last year when we were put on the entity list. essentially at that time we couldn't buy a lot of the products and components already.
I'm experiencing a little bit of a sound issue. Are other people having a problem with the sound? It's kind of juddering a little bit. Nina, does it sound okay? I'm sorry to stop you, Joy.
No, that's okay.
Does it sound okay, Nina? And everybody? All right, why don't you keep going, Joy, and we'll jump in if it's not working.
Okay, hold on.
Yeah, it
okay.
is. Yeah.
Okay, so since last May, our business was impacted already. And just about 2 weeks ago, the situation worsened actually. So basically, companies like Taiwan Semiconductor, if they want to sell chips to Huawei, they will have to apply for licenses. So, obviously Huawei's business will be impacted during this time, and we'll continue to evaluate how much impact it is going to have on our overall business globally. But a lot of U.S. companies and jobs are being impacted at the same time. On average, Huawei buys $11 billion in goods and services from U.S. companies. These are just all kinds of companies, not just chips. So that equates to about 50,000 indirect jobs in the U.S. And the situation in the semiconductor industry, we know U.S. has the largest market share in the world, about 50%. And then China is the biggest semiconductor market, and the demand comes from China. It's about 23% of the overall market. Based on the recent projection by Boston Consulting Group, if the situation like this continues, we'll see the revenue drop for U.S. chip companies, probably like a 16% drop in revenue for these companies in the next 3 to 5 years. And if they completely ban Chinese companies from U.S. Chip companies, the revenue drop for U.S. is going to be about 37% in the next 3 to 5 years. So that's about 40,000 direct jobs in the U.S. semiconductor industry. So that's a huge impact. I think over the long term, companies around the world, especially the chip manufacturers, have to make a choice. If they decide to go with the Chinese tech sector because the huge market there, that will reduce the revenue and research and development for the U.S. tech, the semiconductor industry. So I think long term there will be significant impact for Chinese companies like Huawei and also U.S. companies.
Let's hear, thank you, Joy. Let's hear some American voices. I'd be really curious to hear from both Gary and Sam as to what kind of impact what is the impact of a policy like this on U.S. companies, on the U.S. economy?
I'll jump in first. I think that the way Joy outlined the numbers, I think that makes sense. I think we're in a situation now, though, where people are not really looking at the economic impact. Everything has become a political, debate, back and forth. The practicality is that it will take China a significant period of time to come close to replicating the global semiconductor industry and the innovation required, the capital equipment required to do that. On the other hand, pushing China in that direction really doesn't make a great deal of sense. I think that you have to take the position of Huawei is not Huawei or the Chinese semiconductor industry in general is dependent today, and we've pretty much indicated to them that they should focus becoming less dependent in the future. So the capital, the intellectual capacity, the skill sets are going to push things in that direction. And instead of having discussions on standards and discussions on what it is we're going to be building in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years in semiconductors, we're actually not having those discussions. Everything is in a political framework. And that means the likelihood of coming to a good outcome or a good solution is relatively low at this point.
Sam, did you want to add to that?
I would agree with everything that has been said. I would say that another factor to consider as well is the way that US components are increasingly going to be viewed around the world. So I think the competition between the US and China is less going to be playing out in each other's countries and more going to be playing out in Europe, in India, in emerging markets. And so one of the side effects that we've seen is this view that as the US government operates more from a political view on these things, it creates risk. So other manufacturers around the world that would rely on US parts are going to go, wait a second, having US parts in our supply chains is now a source of risk. So let's maybe design out those parts and go with other vendors. So there are second and third order consequences to this. The other one, which the semiconductor industry has made, and I'm not trying to lobby on their behalf, but I think this is an important point, is, and they've made this to the US defense industrial complex, is look, if we take a hit, we're going to have a hard time supplying the US defense industry, which then becomes a national security issue. If you take this bite out of us, how are we going to be able to rely on us to be able to make the sort of advanced weapons and equipment that the US defense industrial base relies on? And I think earlier they may have found a receptive ear with some folks in the Pentagon on that, and now it looks like less so.
I want to get back to that later, but let's for now turn to the privacy issues. Joy, as you know, so much has been written in the Western press about China's use of technology to track people's movements, to track people's behaviors, focusing largely on the loss of privacy issues. I'm really curious, I know you're not in China now, but just based on your conversations with colleagues, family, et cetera, what's the view in China of privacy issues as they relate to the use of technology to track the movements? What are you hearing out there and seeing in your circles?
Is this better? I hope the sound is.
Yes, yeah, perfect.
Okay, so I think in general, people are okay with the situation right now, especially during the COVID crisis, and people feel, they feel safer when there are stricter controls. It's partly because, Chinese cities are so huge and they're so densely populated, and they have experienced the SARS in 2003. And then they have seen how quickly the pandemic spread out when it first happened in Wuhan. So I think people feel when there are stricter controls, they feel safer. They're willing to follow these rules and policies set up by either the city or the federal government. So I think maybe this is part of the culture as well. And for example, in China, people are just very used to wear face masks. I mean, that's part of the common practice. And during this kind of situation, if people don't wear a face mask, they will seem strange, and people will look at you, how come, this person is not wearing a mask? It's very different from what we have here in the US or in Europe. So I think, in general, people feel safer when there are, this kind of policies. So that's what I'm hearing from families and friends and, colleagues in China.
So a follow-up question, which I think really should be directed to Samm, because I know Samm has done a lot of thinking about this, and Samm, you testified about this. My understanding is that there is a law that requires Chinese tech companies to work with the Chinese government or to share data with the Chinese government if the companies are asked to do so. Can you talk about that a little bit and explain what that law, because this, of course, is kind of at the root, I suppose, of the trust issue. I know you've got a babysitter issue, so we'll skip if we need to, but this is kind of at the root of the trust issue that James talked about, and also at the root of the questions about Huawei in the United States. So can you shed a little light on it? And if you have to skip, we'll come back to you. Go ahead.
About this, let's see if I can get through an answer here.
Yeah.
So we often hear references to a law. There is no single law that says this. What does exist is you have in the counterterrorism law, for example, there's a provision that requires technical assistance to assist in a national security investigation. So what does technical assistance mean exactly? You have a new encryption law that came out in January. You have a regulatory scheme called the multi-level protection scheme. I mean, we could rattle off like a dozen different laws, regulations, standards. I spent a lot of time looking at these in Chinese and English. There is nothing specifically that says you must provide a backdoor, you must turn over data. There are very vague level provisions that, depending on how they're interpreted, as is the case with a lot of Chinese laws, are used selectively as a tool as authorities see fit. Yes, go have water ice. So the question is, yes, if the Chinese government says, you know, we need access to something, do companies say no? Or can they say no if this is really pushed? Look, the reality is so much more complicated, right? So it ends up being this sort of negotiation. It's a dance. And I think sometimes we forget that the local security officials that are enforcing these very vague provisions, they don't just have security as one of their mandates. They also have economic goals as their mandates. So is it necessarily in the economic interest of a local official to compel a company to turn over its data when that data comes with tremendous commercial value that may not be in their interest to do so for commercial reasons? So security and economic interests of local officials are often not considered when we think about the ways that these very vague provisions are implemented. I've had conversations with a number of different tech companies in China who will say, look, there are plenty of examples where we routinely push back on data requests. It's very hard to come out publicly and say that, because then it makes it look like we're resisting our own government. So is the Chinese government increasing its ability to control and monitor the tech sector, particularly in the Xi Jinping regime? Yes. Does it mean that there is no such thing as confidential data in China? No. And I would encourage people to spend more time talking with people on the ground who are actually involved with compliance with these very complicated and vague provisions.
Super interesting. And since we have you in a moment where your childcare is okay, I'm going to jump ahead actually with a follow-up question along those lines, which is that, you know, as you know, the narrative here is that the US is we in the States are super concerned about data and privacy, and that it's a complete free-for-all in China, that the government doesn't care about protecting data privacy at all. Is that narrative correct? Give us a little reality check on that.
Yeah, so, and here again, if we look at the system of contact tracing apps that were rolled out in response to COVID, I think it's safe to say that there are valid concerns about once some of these troves of mobile data from smartphones have been tapped into as a way to identify and track infections, what happens after the pandemic? Is there a way to sort of walk that back? And Raymond Zhang at the New York Times, I thought, did a really excellent article where he highlighted some of the potential next steps here, where you have in Hangzhou, for example, the same apps that were used for contact tracing might now be put in place in a semi-permanent fashion to score people on health, and there's a lot of concerns. But what is also interesting is you've seen a lot of discussion from Chinese scholars, Chinese internet users, who are pushing back and saying, you know, wait a second, there are provisions in China's cybersecurity law that actually talk about consent to collect. And going back to the question of laws, we always cite Chinese laws as examples of why the government can do anything they want, but then in the same breath, people are perfectly willing to dismiss other laws like the spate of personal information protection regulations and the Qiming law as meaningless. So you can't have it both ways. Either you think the law is meaningful or it's meaningless. And what the reality is, there's kind of this dual narrative that's happening. So yes, you have the government increasingly looking at tapping into big data and using that as a source of control. At the National People's Congress this year, we had an announcement that the personal information protection law is actually in advanced stages, and privacy for the first time was written into the civil code. So will skeptics look at this and go, this is meaningless? Fine. but you have to at least acknowledge that there is more friction in the system, and none of this wouldn't be moving forward if that didn't exist. It is also, in my final point, it's important to highlight something that I call sort of China's split privacy identity. So as we see a whole new host of regulations coming on the books related to how data is collected, how it's stored, how it's shared, there is some concern that a lot of these new restrictions are focused on consumer privacy. So they're more an attempt to curtail what the companies do, but not what the government can do. And the question is there a meaningful way to restrict government access to data? Are there meaningful avenues for contestation, for oversight, for enforcement? And that's where it gets much more problematic.
Yeah.
Dinda,
Please go ahead,
sorry,
Gary.
if I can add one thing.
Yeah.
Sometimes we don't appreciate in the US the skill and propensity for the Chinese government to experiment. And so what you have with a lot of these apps, whether in a lot of the other technology innovations, whether it's autonomous driving, scale experiments like Shenzhen back 35 years ago, is there's constant experimentation with technology in China. And it is, quite a bit of it is at the behest of the government, but a lot of it turns out to be just an experiment. I think the contact tracing and things, we'll see where that winds up going. I think the overriding concern of the government is they've been surprised a couple times by the fact that technology companies, particularly Alibaba and Tencent, wound up knowing more about their own customers and their own citizens than the Chinese government did. And I'm pretty sure that in the back of a number of these policies now is keeping that from happening again. Meaning we're still going to have some kind of privacy, but we don't want companies to necessarily know more about our own citizens than we do. And kind of in the weeds behind some of these discussions, that seems to be, at least to us in the Qiming side, that seems to be what comes through.
Joy, surely Huawei has been part of these discussions as the security privacy law is being drafted. Can you share anything about that? Like, is it what kind of a give and take is there between a company like Huawei and the government as this law is being written?
Well, just as Sam mentioned earlier, this kind of law is not. I don't think China is unique. In terms of this kind of intelligence law, it is for counterterrorism or for things similar to that. And Huawei is not involved in the legislation process. But what I want to mention is really the Chinese government has never asked Huawei to provide any customer data to them. And our founder, Mr. Ren, has mentioned that in media interviews. And he said if the government asks for data, he will not give the information to the government. And then one very key aspect is really Huawei is an equipment vendor. After we sell the equipment to the operators, we no longer have access to the equipment. So the operators operate and maintain the network, and they have access to end users' data. If they need any upgrade or maintenance of the network equipment, Huawei engineer will have to be authorized to do this work. And whatever the engineer is doing on their computer, every keystroke is logged, monitored by the operators. So they know what Huawei engineers are doing on their network. And if they see any abnormal behavior or any diversion of traffic, and they will immediately find out. So Huawei, has been operating in this space around the world for over 20 years. We never had a single cybersecurity related incident. So we're trusted by these operators around the world. And we have been working with the UK government for the last 10 years. There's a third-party independent testing center oversaw by the UK government. They have every year they issue a report, and last year they have said there's no backdoor in Huawei's equipment. So all these years work and track record have demonstrated Huawei can be trusted our solutions and technology should be trusted. So I think that's really, we continue to advocate, cybersecurity is a shared responsibility, not just the equipment vendors, the operators, the service providers, and end users all have to play a role in securing the cyberspace. And we need to have global standards. We need to test every vendor during this process. You can't just test Huawei's equipment and ignore other vendors during in this supply chain. So I think that's the message we've been trying to convey.
Gary and Sam, are you, what do you see happening in the US? Are you expecting the controversy over privacy in the US and tech tracking to grow as Google and Apple roll out their new technologies? And do you feel like, the US concerns about privacy are well placed?
So if you look at, Apple and Google announced, or Alphabet announced their contact tracing apps, the reception, to say it was lukewarm would be very kind. And so there was virtually no receptivity to that at all. I think that everyone now is too obsessed with the combination of COVID, the combination of the protests of the streets of the cities in the US, you have the election. And I think what'll happen is there'll be some very hard analysis done as we look at the summer, and you start to see if cases start to spike again in COVID, we need to do more contact tracing. Communities start to insist on being able to know where you are, who you've been with. So I think that will come from the pressure of simply dealing with that outbreak, dealing with that pandemic. The bigger issue will be are you influenced online? And I think nothing will happen on that before the election, but I expect during the election process, the term I'm looking for, the post-mortem on the election will involve a huge amount of analysis on how people were influenced, how people were contacted, what kind of data was used. And so I think we're probably about a year away from having our hands on really the level of legal and political impact on how people view privacy in the US. If you ask the average American, they would say, obviously, yes, very much. But online, we don't behave that way at all.
Sam, what do you see? Do you want to add something to that?
Well, I think one of the reasons why the Google Apple solution was met with far less than a lukewarm reception is almost it went so far on the side of privacy as to make itself sort of completely ineffective. So there's a question with these contact tracing solutions. There's different ways you can, one of the things is the data centralized or decentralized? Another is, are they mandatory or are they opt-in? And this is that classic trade-off, right? But in going so far on the side of privacy protections with decentralized data, with having them opt in, and that's just the technology. These solutions are not effective unless they're married with a very robust system that has nothing to do with digital technologies, that has to do with a rigorous testing system in place, that has to do with observing lockdowns, all of these things. So the combination of those factors just made it ineffective. I will say though, on this the broader question of US privacy law, and this gets back to the issue of what kinds of restrictions are in place on Chinese companies, what kinds of restrictions are in place on US companies. One of the things that I've been advocating is for all companies, we need more robust rules around retention and collection of data. And this is why having federal privacy law in the US is very much tied to national security issues related to Chinese companies. And the way to get at it is not to start playing whack-a-mole with different companies that you identify as a bad actor. The way to get at it is to limit the amount of sensitive data that all companies, regardless of national origin, have access to. So let's think about, say, the Equifax hack, where where that's presumed to be a Chinese state-sponsored cyber hack. Well, if Equifax Equifax never should have held on to the amount of data in the first place that would make it so vulnerable to being exploited by a sophisticated state actor. The same thing would go for a company like TikTok, right? If companies in the first place can't have access to that data, then that right there is a way to sort of prevent the kinds of, whether it's hacking, whether it's transfer back to a government that you don't want it to have access to. And in the meantime, what it does is it says, look, we're getting our own house in order, right? Because I think the idea that the sort of free-for-all Silicon Valley, don't regulate us because then we can't compete with China, that's just sort of a false binary. And we need to begin to sort of offer a more affirmative vision on our own about data governance.
Hey, Sam,
Yeah.
sorry, have you seen more of a discussion now around companies holding data for particular time frames? Meaning something like Equifax, you needed certain information in order to approve someone for something, but after that, you don't. And so we have, the systems exist to allow that to happen. We just haven't administered them to enforce that.
Absolutely. So this is why it's collection is one piece, but retention, how long are they holding the data, is really key to this too. So I totally agree.
Wow, fascinating. So let's turn now to the question of how technology and big data are being used to fight COVID. And Joy, we'd love to hear a little bit about how Huawei is applying 5G technology to the fight against COVID in China. I know Huawei has been working with hospitals in Wuhan. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing and how 5G has helped in fighting the virus?
Yeah, Huawei has many different technologies from, 5G infrastructure to devices to cloud and AI. So we're applying all these technologies to help with healthcare, public safety, e-government, education. So I want to give you some examples. Wuhan built 2 brand new hospitals, and they built them like within 10 days. And Huawei was helping these hospitals to set up the 5G infrastructure, basically. So with 5G, and you can enable a lot of AI applications as well. So one of the key changes for the COVID-19 patient is their lung structure. So you can only detect that through CT scan. So traditionally, a CT scan, will take about 12 minutes for medical specialist to read the picture and then make the diagnosis. And we use AI and combine with the specialist. So the AI actually can read the scan within just 10 seconds, and quickly that result can be confirmed by a specialist within 2 minutes. So from 12 minutes down to 2 minutes. So it's like 6 times an increase in efficiency. So, we were able to connect a lot of doctors from different cities, because Wuhan was so heavily hit, and there were not enough medical professionals to do all this work. So with 5G, you will be able to do remote diagnosis and remote treatment, and leveraging the medical staff from around the country. So that's one example on AI application. And the other one—
Jump in for a second before you go to the next example. I'm just wondering, is this something that the United States has learned from China, or is there any sharing? In other words, are US hospitals doing the same kind of thing, using the same kind of 5G to read the CT scans so much more quickly?
I don't know specifically, but I know, in the US, there are a lot of online medical visits. During this time, people don't really want to go to the hospitals or go to doctors in person, but they're doing remote doctor visits. So that has increased a lot. But I don't know if they're using 5G and AI to make diagnosis.
Right.
And I think another application for 5G plus AI is really to do drug screening. And Huawei was using our cloud technology and AI to help Chinese Research Institute to do, drug screening, and they screened 160 million molecular compound in the library, and they that's like during a week time frame, and then they came out with 8,500 drugs that potentially can be effective to treat COVID-19. And then, with all these AI applications, they were able to do 10 million simulation calculations within 1 day. And finally, they screened out 5 antiviral drugs during this whole process. So this is what we're seeing using, AI to, do diagnosis much faster, and to screen drugs. And there are many other applications as well, like you see these thermal scanning at airports and train stations. Those are enabled by 5G and AI as well. Yeah.
Got it.
Dinda,
Go ahead.
if you
Gary.
want an example of how this isn't working now between the US and China, there's a Chinese company called Infravision that happens to be a Qiming investment. So we've had 8 companies investing or doing protocols around COVID. So the first Chinese vaccine company, CanSino, is a Qiming company. One of the first 3 companies to do the genome testing the genome typing was a Qiming company. And Infravision does what Joy was talking about, which is take CT scans and very rapidly determine whether or not your lungs have had any exposure to the virus, whether there's any active particles in the lungs. The US government made the decision they didn't want any help with this. So it was proposed that this be brought to the US to help with screening, and the feedback was, we don't want AI support from China. And so that's where you start to see the politicization of the use of technology. So these systems are in Japan, they're at use in Italy, they're at use all over China. They have tens of thousands of patients now that they've been proven on. But the political process here said, we don't want to take that AI from China. So that's the mentality that hopefully we get away from at some point in the near future.
So I want to jump in and say that in a few minutes, I'm going to open this conversation up to questions from the audience. So what you need to do is click on participants and raise your hand. Okay, there's a hand icon that you need to click on, and then when I see your hand raised, I will call on you and you'll be able to ask your question. But you know what, so time is precious, so let's jump into that question, which is really the ultimate concern, I suppose, which is what happens if we have a bifurcated world? And what happens, it looks like what you're suggesting, Gary, is that there's not a lot of sharing going on. I was going to ask you, Joy, how much sharing is there in terms of big data between, China and the United States right now, but what happens, so, talk about that and what happens in the future if there is no sharing of big data between the 2 countries? That's a question for all of you.
Well, I think there is a great deal of collaboration. I mean, I think that it's not good form now politically to talk about it,
Okay.
but I actually think there's a great deal of collaboration at the scientific level, academic level, large numbers of student transfers and so on. And so I think that the mistake that is going to happen is people will start to take the organizations that facilitate that, politicize that, and that'll make that much more difficult.
Well, it's already happening, right? I mean, you already have Chinese scientists in America who are coming under scrutiny.
Well, and some with good reason, because they didn't disclose hundreds of thousands of dollars of payments they received. So assuming there are no angels or no saints in this particular process, it really comes down to what it is the U.S., how does the U.S. prioritize these activities, these cooperative activities? How does China, prioritize that? But I think that the difference between the kind of collaboration that will be required, AI will require collaboration because we're going to have some common rules of the road relative to, as Sam was talking about, how do you collect data? How long do you maintain the data? How's the data analyzed? Who owns the data? Who owns your own personal data? If the world splits to where there are multiple forms of that, things will get very messy. And so what you hope happens is at the standard body level, anything associated with broad-based policy, there's at least entities talking to each other at the government level. Right now, clearly that's not happening anywhere near the level that I would like to see. And others may have different opinion, but I don't think we're anywhere near where we need to be today on that. But the amount of data and the sharing of data across borders, Chinese patient data can now be shared in a way it doesn't have to leave China. You can use different kinds of encryption algorithms and actually look at and modify data without breaking the encryption.
So is it your understanding that American doctors, scientists, hospitals are learning whatever they can from the Chinese experience?
They're learning some, but not nearly what they could be, and vice versa. Because the technology solution to take data, put it in what's called homomorphic encryption, have people be able to manipulate that to their purposes without changing or modifying the core data, that technology exists. But instead of focusing on how we proliferate that, we've kind of retreated to our respective corners and said, well, you can't have any of our stuff. Well, that long term is just not the right answer.
Sam and Joy?
Well, from what I have heard, that some of the doctors, they're really well-known doctors who fought in the front line in Wuhan, had shared, findings with U.S. researchers and medical staff, and people from Europe as well. I think it's good to, definitely we need to share the information because there's so many unknowns of the virus, of the pandemic, but they're probably not very organized, and they're just doing that on their own, not very organized. But I think just in general, from a technology perspective, Huawei's business has been impacted. A lot of tech sectors in the U.S. are being impacted. When I've talked about jobs and businesses and revenues and all that, I think for the longer term, the technology decoupling will actually make the innovation more expensive and slower. And we have seen that from 2G to 3G evolution timeframe. There are different technology standards in Europe and in the US. So it took longer time for the operators to deploy the network, to manufacture different devices to accommodate different standards. So eventually the consumers actually end up paying for the price, right? You pay more money for less innovation. So we really don't want to see that happen again, because really for the first time for 5G, we have a global unified standard. And we definitely want to see this kind of global collaboration continue. And I think, another impact of this kind of decoupling is really, this will make the cyber world more vulnerable. And when you eliminate one or two, key infrastructure players, and the remaining of the equipment vendors don't necessarily have incentive to embrace the industry leading technology for cybersecurity. And it creates more vulnerabilities, more single points of failure. So I think the cyberspace is going to be more vulnerable if you have less player, less competitor in the field. So we don't want to see that happen either. So definitely, we want to see continued global collaboration and joint innovation from research and from universities, institutes, and from businesses in general. We don't want the global supply chain to be disrupted.
Sam, your thoughts on a bifurcated world?
Well, I was really glad that Gary brought up the point about homomorphic encryption, because I think oftentimes we're just focused on the policy solutions to this and less focused on the technology solutions to this. And so and particularly when it comes
I think you're going to have to explain to us what homomorphic encryption is.
Gary,
I'm going to let it slide, but since you're bringing it up again.
Gary, I'm going to let you do that one.
Or just roughly, generally speaking.
Generally, there are different sort of techniques that can be used to keep data anonymous while getting the benefit of training that data to make using machine learning to make AI systems smarter, right? So there are techniques that sort of keep the data protected while tapping into the innovation that comes from the learning on the data. And there are a number of these sort of techniques. And I think that that needs to be, that's a really important part of the conversation. I'm really concerned about both coming from Beijing and from Washington. I think we're seeing increased data nationalization. And it's not just these two governments, right? India's doing it. There's sort of a rise around the world with governments looking to wrap sovereign borders around data, essentially saying, my citizens' data needs to stop at the physical border of the country in order to make that data most secure. And I think that so as we're seeing this sort of race to the bottom in sort of nationalizing data, these kinds of techniques are increasingly important to sort of create assurances so that data can flow freely, so that we can get the public health benefits, for example, of sharing data sets while keeping those data sets secure.
Okay, so I'm going to open it up to questions. I see a couple here right now. Earl Carr. Nina, can you unmute Earl so he can ask a question?
Yes. Good afternoon.
A little bit louder. We can't hear you, Earl.
Sure.
Good afternoon.
That's better.
Dinda, can you hear me better now?
Oh, sure can.
Great. And great to see you, Gary. Thanks for a very lively discussion. I was curious and fascinated with the notion of the retention of data for a limited period of time for companies that are experimenting in this kind of notion. Can you give some specific examples of which US companies are doing that, either US or Chinese companies, and what should be done to better promote this concept more widely, both here in the United States, China, and the globe more broadly? Thank you.
So the comment would be, I can't give you the names of companies that I know for a fact are doing that. It's an observation more based on the discussions of what's capable in the technology. And certainly with cloud, certainly with the advent of more cloud computing and more decentralized data storage, you certainly have the ability to say that even you could even say the data resides there, but you've lost your access to it. This is a development that needs to happen, but generally because it'll be expensive and it'll take some time, until there's a policy around saying you have to do it, companies will generally not do that. Facebook will not willingly say they no longer have access to 10 or 20-year-old photos. I mean, that's just not going to happen, willingly. So I think we're in the process of, again, we don't right now have that conversation, but the technology is there to completely allow and facilitate that. I don't know, Sam, if you or Joy have examples, specific examples you can talk about that happening. We hear that with a lot of our portfolio companies now in fintech, saying that the idea of accrediting someone to enter into the system doesn't mean that you need everything you needed for that accreditation on a permanent basis. So it's kind of like you access it as you need it.
So here I think at least on the policy side, the Chinese conversation is sort of counterintuitively ahead in the United States. If we just look at what's written down, China's personal information security specification, which is like the landmark data privacy standard, has section 6 is all about retention limits. And I just pulled it up and I was reading it. It says, the PI retention period should be the shortest time needed to achieve the purpose. After the aforementioned PI retention period, controllers should carry out deletion or anonymization. There was also a guideline that came out in the early days of the virus. I'm about to get a visit from my son in a moment, so please excuse this interruption. You have to wait.
Someone's still downstairs to be called Sophie.
Okay, cool. So there was a notice also that came out from the Cybersecurity Administration of China, I think it was in February, which similarly had retention limits on after sort of trying to control data from being used beyond sort of epidemiological or public health purposes. So again, we can debate, how is this being implemented? How is it being enforced? Are there proper oversight mechanisms? Is there a way to read this to say this is the way that the government wants to get more control over the way that private internet platforms are handling data? of course, it's a very complicated picture, but if we just look at from a policy conversation standpoint, there is nothing like that beyond sector-specific regulations in the United States for health data and in the financial sector. China's sort of moving out in the policy conversation.
It's so fascinating. And insofar as China Institute is really committed to trying to add nuance and complexity to these conversations, you have certainly done that, all of you today. And I'm feeling maybe more confused, which is probably a good thing. But that idea that China is really driving a conversation about privacy, you know, data privacy, et cetera, is just totally fascinating. But okay, we got another question from Jeffrey Tao. Can we unmute Jeffrey Tao, please? Jeffrey, we can't hear you. You need to unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Yep.
Yes. I'd like to thank Dinda for moderating and all the three panelists for a very interesting discussion. There was a certain amount of discussion about today about the lack of trust between the two countries, and for the most part, it's been focused on the two governments, and relations have become increasingly tense, with escalating vitriol between the two sides, and that doesn't help. Now, there's mistrust between the two countries, but perhaps my concern is, as someone who has enduring and deep ties with both countries, is that the affection between the American and the Chinese peoples is starting to wane or decline. According to polls, 2/3 of Americans either mistrust or dislike China or the Chinese. Is this something we should be worried about, and what implications, negative implications, could that have on cooperation between the two sides, the peoples of the two sides, not only governments, on every front, science, medicine, technology, data protection? Could you please comment on that? Thank you.
Great question. Anybody want to take that one about the waning?
In the spirit of knowing that answering this question means you're wrong in whatever you say, I would say that when you have, we have to get past the point where the leadership of both countries villainize the other. Because you have to, many of us, certainly probably all the 50, 60 people on this call, we have access to lots of different pieces of information. Very little of it comes from the government. That's not the case in China. You know, half of China receives most of its information on the news. That's tightly controlled. We have certain elected officials in the United States that have a very loud voice, and that has a very specific, you know, focus. And neither of those entities are particularly trust-oriented. And it's very much against what I think the historical interaction has been between the Chinese people, American people, and so on. So until that mitigates itself, I think it's very, very difficult. I think it is a real risk. You know, I have friends who believe things now in China that 2 or 3 years ago they never would have believed, just because it's been repeated 10, 20, 30 times. And I think that that's something that we need to be incredibly sensitive about, and incredibly aware of. Yeah.
Any other comments?
Can I just say something here? I am really concerned about this right now. And I think that, look, we've had, it's sort of a tradition in US politics to bash China to boost your electoral prospects. But I think right now, the stakes could not be more grave, right? We are talking about an election in the United States where I think that that US democracy is at stake. And so right now, if when Trump going into this election has over 100,000 deaths and an economy at a level not seen since the Great Depression, by blaming China for that, and look, both sides are responsible. We had suppression of information in the virus in China in the early days that could have saved thousands of lives around the world. But we also had a flat-footed response by the Trump administration in February and March that also, so both of them have deaths on their hands. But for this president, Cyrus, you have to wait. For this president to look to get reelected, riding the card of popularity for blaming China, what's at stake here is US democracy. And I feel very emotional about this, and I try not to bring in emotion to this conversation, but I think particularly right now, it's very hard not to have this conversation and an understanding of how grave the stakes are.
Yep.
So
I think we're all feeling very emotional. Go ahead, Gary.
So Dinda, one last thing was what Sam meant, what Sam really, I think, is referencing, which I feel also very emotional about, is the US used to approach things from the view of values. So the lens that we looked at the world was always a values-based lens. And people around the world tend to rely upon that. And that's a discussion that we really lose at our peril. If we lose that frame of reference, that is a huge loss for the United States. I don't expect China to change its system and suddenly become a higher trust society. But I do expect the US, I expect more of the US in that particular discussion.
Joy, what do you see in terms of Chinese views of America? That's the other side of the coin, right?
Well, you know, I came to this country for school because I knew US has the best school system. And, you know, I wasn't able to do the kind of research I wanted to do in China because at the time there was not enough funding to do that. I was in biology, neuroscience. So that's why I came to the US to study, and then I stayed here. I think we're experiencing a very challenging time between the two countries, and there's a lot of distrust. And you know, at the general public level, there are, you know, I saw in New York there were this Asian hate crimes, right? That is because the COVID-19, and so we really need to work together. These two countries are so intertwined, and we cannot just completely separate. And there's so many things that are connected. We're doing joint research, we're doing development, we share the supply chain. So it's really, I mean, it is so important for us to continue to overcome whatever challenge we have today, to continue to work together. I mean, Huawei is caught in the middle of this, and sometimes it just feels almost impossible to deliver Huawei side of the message. But we just have to have a longer term of, you know, view on this. We're going to struggle maybe for another year, another 3 years, but hopefully over the long term, we can work together. I think, you know, we need to get people to understand each other more. That's what we're doing. We're trying to bring US journalists, influencers, or professors to China for them to see China, for them to see Huawei, so that they can better understand what this country, what this company is all about. So I think we need to continue to bridge that gap, the understanding gap, the culture gap, and the communication gap. And, you know, we are here to help doing that and continue to help these two countries, help the people to understand each other better.
So well put. I'm so sorry to the other people who wanted to ask questions. I think our time is really up, but I just wanted to thank you for sharing your wisdom. We heard about data nationalization. We heard about the need for continued global collaboration and joint innovation. We learned about homomorphic encryption, a new vocabulary word for me. And you all spoke very eloquently about the need to work together and the fact that we're so intertwined. So I just want to thank you for adding nuance and complexity, for confusing all of us more, which is a good thing. And I think, you know, as human beings, we certainly hope that we can, those kinds of cutting edge solutions that scientists and data technologists, et cetera, are finding can be shared. So just thank you so much for joining us today. And everybody, I hope that you will sign up, become members of China Institute, because we are trying to bring nuance to these conversations. As Sam said, the stakes are very, very high right now. And we also feel very strongly about that. So thank you for participating and for having such an honest discussion about these issues.
Thank you.